She thought she was clever, forging documents and playing the grieving widow. But what she didn't know was that her own greed would unravel everything in front of a room full of witnesses. Jessica Martinez never imagined that returning from her father's funeral would lead to discovering a web of lies so deep it would cost her stepmother not just her inheritance, but her freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica had always considered herself fortunate when her father Richard married Helena 5 years ago. At 32, Jessica was old enough to see beyond typical step-family dynamics, and Helena seemed genuinely devoted to Richard during his battle with pancreatic cancer. She moved into their family home in Asheville, North Carolina, seamlessly taking over household duties while Jessica balanced her demanding career as a pediatric nurse in Charlotte, 2 hours away. Helena Crawford arrived in their lives like a breath of fresh air during Richard's darkest period. At 48, she was elegant, well-spoken, and claimed to have experience caring for terminally ill patients from her previous work as a hospice coordinator in Florida. She wore her silver hair in a neat bob, dressed conservatively, and spoke with a slight Southern accent that made her seem both sophisticated and approachable. Richard, who had been widowed for 8 years after Jessica's mother died in a car accident, found comfort in Helena's gentle presence and apparent expertise in medical care. The courtship was swift, but seemed genuine. Helena moved from her small apartment in Hendersonville to help care for Richard full-time, refusing his offers to pay her for what she insisted was simply love and devotion. She cooked his favorite meals, managed his medications with meticulous precision, and created detailed charts tracking his symptoms and treatments. When Richard's conditions stabilized temporarily, Helena suggested they marry, saying she wanted to ensure she could make medical decisions for him if needed, and that it would give them both peace of mind. Jessica supported the marriage wholeheartedly. She witnessed how Helena's presence had improved her father's spirits and health management. During weekend visits, she observed Helena reading to Richard from his favorite history books, maintaining his beloved garden when he became too weak, and speaking to his doctors with informed questions that showed genuine concern. Helena even encouraged Richard to reconcile with his estranged brother Marcus, whom he hadn't spoken to in 15 years over a business dispute. The wedding was small but touching, held in the garden Helena had been tending so carefully. Richard, despite his illness, looked happier than Jessica had seen him since her mother's death. Helena wore a simple blue dress and seemed to glow with contentment as she promised to love and care for Richard in sickness and in health till death do us part. Jessica served as maid of honor, genuinely moved by what appeared to be a love story born from the most difficult circumstances. Over the following months, Helena proved herself to be everything she had promised. She managed Richard's increasingly complex medical needs with the skill of a professional caregiver, maintained detailed records of his treatments, and coordinated with his oncology team. She also took over the household finances, which Richard appreciated as his energy waned. She handled bill payments, insurance claims, and even helped Richard organize his business affairs as he prepared to retire permanently from his successful landscape architecture firm. Jessica noticed how Helena had transformed their family home into something resembling a high-end care facility. Medical equipment was arranged efficiently but discreetly, medication schedules were posted throughout the house, and Helena had even installed safety features like grab bars and ramps without making Richard feel diminished. She attended every doctor's appointment, taking detailed notes and asking follow-up questions that impressed the medical staff. Several nurses commented to Jessica about how fortunate Richard was to have such a dedicated and knowledgeable caregiver. During this period, Helena also became Jessica's closest confidant about her father's condition. She spoke regularly by phone, with Helena providing detailed updates about Richard's good days and bad days, his appetite, his pain levels, and his emotional state. She often suggested the best times to visit when Richard would be most alert and comfortable. Helena demonstrated remarkable financial responsibility. She insisted on keeping detailed records of any household expenses and refused Richard's attempts to give her access to his larger accounts, saying she only needed enough to cover daily necessities and medical supplies. She even returned money to Richard when she spent less than he had allocated for household needs. This careful approach to finances further convinced Jessica that Helena's motivations were pure and that her father had found not just a companion, but a genuine partner. The relationship between Jessica and Helena grew stronger during Richard's final year. Helena included Jessica in all major decisions about Richard's care, often calling her before doctor's appointments to discuss questions they should ask. She also encouraged Jessica to create memory projects with her father, suggesting they record videos of him, telling family stories, and compile photo albums together. These activities became precious bonding time for Jessica and Richard, and she felt grateful to Helena for understanding their importance. Helena's attention to detail extended beyond medical care. She researched Richard's family history to help him complete a genealogy project he had started years earlier. She learned to cook family recipes that had been passed down from Jessica's grandmother, asking for detailed instructions and practicing until she could prepare them exactly as Richard remembered from his childhood. She even took up watercolor painting, knowing Richard had always admired the medium, and they would spend quiet afternoons painting together in the sunroom. As Richard's condition deteriorated, Helena's dedication never wavered. She arranged for a hospital bed to be installed in the master bedroom so Richard could remain comfortable at home. She coordinated with hospice care while maintaining her round-the-clock vigilance. During Richard's final weeks, Helena rarely left his side, sleeping in a chair next to his bed and monitoring his breathing throughout the night.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She held his hand during his most difficult moments and read to him from his favorite passages in literature when pain medication made conversation difficult. The funeral arrangements Helena made were perfect tributes to Richard's life. She organized a service that reflected his love of nature, his professional achievements, and his devotion to family. She displayed photos spanning Richard's entire life, including many of Jessica's mother that she had carefully preserved. Helena spoke beautifully at the service about Richard's courage during his illness and his love for Jessica, bringing many mourners to tears with her heartfelt words about the privilege of caring for such a remarkable man. In the weeks following the funeral, Helena appeared to be processing her grief in healthy ways. She maintained the house exactly as Richard had liked it, tending to his garden and keeping his office organized but unchanged. She spoke often about how much she missed him, but also expressed gratitude for the time they had shared together. She continued to check on Jessica regularly, concerned about how she was coping with the loss while managing her demanding career. Helena also began talking about practical matters with appropriate sensitivity. She mentioned that she would need to make some decisions about the house and Richard's belongings, but emphasized that she wanted Jessica to have time to process her grief first. She suggested they might go through Richard's personal items together when Jessica felt ready, and she assured Jessica that anything with sentimental value would be hers regardless of any legal documents. This considerate approach reinforced Jessica's belief that Helena was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had genuinely loved Richard and wanted to honor his memory while respecting his daughter's needs. Helena's behavior in the months following Richard's death seemed to confirm everything positive Jessica had observed about her character during their marriage. She appeared to be the ideal stepmother, widow, and family member that anyone could hope for in such difficult circumstances. What Jessica couldn't have known was that beneath Helena's perfect facade lay a carefully constructed deception that had been years in the making. Helena Crawford wasn't the devoted caregiver and loving wife she appeared to be, but rather a sophisticated con artist who had targeted Richard from the moment she learned about his diagnosis and substantial assets. Every kind gesture, every thoughtful detail, every moment of apparent devotion had been calculated moves in a long-term strategy to position herself as the rightful heir to Richard's considerable estate. Helena had done her research thoroughly. She knew that Richard was a widower with substantial assets from his successful business, valuable real estate holdings, and considerable savings. She had learned that Jessica was his only child, and that Richard had been estranged from other family members, making him particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Helena had crafted her entire identity around becoming indispensable to Richard, studying medical terminology and caregiving techniques to appear knowledgeable, and carefully building trust with both Richard and Jessica over years of seemingly selfless service. The woman Jessica knew was Helena Crawford had even fabricated her background.
Her previous experience wasn't in hospice care, but in real estate fraud, and her gentle Southern accent was practiced rather than natural. She had changed her name and moved to North Carolina specifically to target wealthy, vulnerable individuals, and Richard had been her most ambitious mark yet. Every detail of her personality, from her interest in gardening to her newfound love of watercolor painting, had been researched and adopted specifically to appeal to Richard's interests and needs. Even Helena's apparent financial responsibility had been strategic. By refusing access to Richard's larger accounts initially, she had established trust that would later allow her to gain access to everything. Her detailed record-keeping wasn't born from genuine care, but from the need to track Richard's assets and understand his financial situation completely. She had spent years learning about his investments, his business relationships, and his estate planning, all while appearing to be simply a devoted wife concerned with daily household management. The reconciliation Helena had encouraged between Richard and his brother Marcus hadn't been motivated by genuine concern for family relationships, but by her discovery that Marcus was named as a backup executor in Richard's original will. By facilitating their reconciliation, Helena had positioned herself to better understand and potentially manipulate the estate planning process. She had carefully observed family dynamics during their renewed relationship, gathering information about potential challenges to Richard's estate that she might need to address. Helena's grief and consideration following Richard's death were as calculated as everything else. She knew that appearing to process loss naturally and showing concern for Jessica's emotional needs would maintain the trust she had built over years. Her suggestions about going through Richard's belongings together weren't motivated by genuine sensitivity, but by the need to control what Jessica discovered about the estate and to ensure that any evidence of Helena's deception remained hidden. The perfect funeral arrangements and Helena's touching eulogy had served multiple purposes. They reinforced her image as a devoted widow in the eyes of the community, potentially important witnesses in any future legal proceedings. They also demonstrated her intimate knowledge of Richard's life and preferences, supporting any claims she might make about his final wishes or intentions regarding his estate. Even the decision to preserve photos of Jessica's mother had been strategic, designed to reinforce the image of Helena as someone who respected and honored Richard's previous marriage, rather than someone who might be motivated by jealousy or greed. As Jessica prepared to return to her normal routine in Charlotte, believing that her father's affairs were in the capable hands of a grieving but trustworthy widow, Helena was already implementing the next phase of her plan. The documents she had been forging during Richard's final months were ready to be presented, the financial institutions where Richard held accounts had been contacted with carefully crafted stories about lost paperwork, and Helena had prepared detailed explanations for any questions that might arise during the probate process. What Helena hadn't anticipated was that her years of careful deception had created a detailed trail of evidence that would eventually expose her fraud. Her meticulous documentation, originally intended to support her claims to Richard's estate, would become the very evidence that proved her guilt. The relationship she had carefully cultivated with medical professionals, financial advisors, and family friends would become a network of witnesses who could testify to her calculated behavior. And Jessica's trust, which Helena had worked so hard to earn and maintain, would transform into a determination to seek justice that Helena hadn't expected from the quiet, grieving daughter she thought she had successfully manipulated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true extent of Helena's betrayal and the shocking lengths she had gone to steal not just Richard's money, but his final months of peace and his daughter's trust. The perfect stepmother was about to be exposed as something far more sinister, and the will reading that Helena anticipated would confirm her victory would instead become the beginning of her downfall. The first crack in Helena's perfect facade appeared 3 weeks after the funeral, during what should have been a routine conversation about settling Richard's affairs.
Jessica had driven up from Charlotte on a Saturday morning, expecting to spend the day going through her father's personal belongings and discussing practical matters like the house and his business assets. Instead, she found herself sitting across from Helena at the kitchen table, listening to explanations that didn't quite make sense. Helena had prepared coffee and arranged Richard's financial documents in neat folders, appearing every bit the organized widow Jessica had come to expect. She spoke in the same gentle, concerned tone she had always used when discussing Richard's care. But something felt different. The words came too quickly, the explanations too detailed, and Helena's eyes didn't quite meet Jessica's when she described the current state of Richard's accounts. According to Helena, Richard had made significant changes to his financial arrangements during his final months, moving money between accounts and updating beneficiaries on various investments. She explained that he had been concerned about tax implications and wanted to ensure everything would be handled smoothly after his death. Helena presented documentation showing that Richard had consolidated most of his assets under joint accounts with her, giving her full access and control as his surviving spouse. Jessica listened carefully, trying to process information that seemed both plausible and troubling. She had always trusted her father's judgment about financial matters, and he had certainly been capable of making such decisions during the early stages of his illness. However, she couldn't recall any conversations about major financial restructuring, and her father had always been someone who discussed important decisions with her, especially those that might affect her inheritance. Helena seemed to anticipate Jessica's concerns, explaining that Richard had wanted to handle these matters privately to avoid causing her additional stress during his treatment. She showed Jessica what appeared to be Richard's handwritten notes discussing his desire to ensure Helena would be financially secure after his death, given that she had sacrificed her own career and security to care for him. The notes expressed Richard's intention to leave Helena the house and a substantial portion of his liquid assets, while ensuring Jessica would receive his business interests and some investment accounts. The documentation looked legitimate, bearing Richard's signature on forms that Helena said had been prepared by his lawyer. However, Jessica noticed that many of the documents were dated during the final weeks of Richard's life, when he had been heavily medicated and often confused. She asked Helena about this timing, and Helena explained that Richard had actually been very clear during his lucid moments about wanting to finalize these arrangements, worried that he might not have another opportunity. Jessica requested contact information for Richard's lawyer to discuss the estate planning directly. Helena's response was smooth, but concerning. She explained that Richard had switched attorneys during his final months, wanting to work with someone who specialized in estate planning for blended families. The new attorney was someone Helena had researched and recommended, a specialist who understood the complexities of protecting surviving spouses while ensuring children from previous marriages were treated fairly. When Jessica asked to contact this new attorney, Helena provided a business card for someone named David Thornton, claiming he was currently traveling and might be difficult to reach immediately. She suggested they wait until after the formal will reading, which had been scheduled for the following week, before involving lawyers unnecessarily. Helena emphasized that everything would be clearly explained during the official probate process, and that there was no need for Jessica to worry about the legal details. Something about Helena's responses triggered Jessica's instincts as a healthcare professional. Throughout her career, she had learned to recognize when patients or family members were withholding information or not telling the complete truth about medical situations.
Helena's behavior reminded her of family members who were hiding addiction issues or covering up neglect of elderly relatives. The explanations were too perfect, too comprehensive, and delivered with just slightly too much confidence. Jessica decided to conduct her own investigation, starting with Richard's longtime financial advisor, Margaret Chen, whom her father had worked with for over 15 years. Margaret had handled Richard's business accounts and personal investments, and Jessica was certain she would have been involved in any major financial restructuring. When Jessica called Margaret's office, she discovered the first concrete evidence that Helena's story was not entirely accurate. Margaret seemed surprised to hear from Jessica and immediately expressed concern about Richard's financial situation in his final months. She explained that Richard had indeed made some changes to his accounts, but not the extensive restructuring Helena had described. According to Margaret, Richard had added Helena as a beneficiary on several accounts and given her limited access to checking accounts for household expenses, but he had never transferred ownership of his major assets or business interests. More troubling, Margaret revealed that someone had been calling her office repeatedly in the weeks following Richard's death, claiming to be his attorney and requesting detailed information about all of his accounts. When Margaret asked for proper documentation to release such information, the calls stopped. She had assumed it was a legitimate inquiry from the estate attorney, but now she was concerned that someone might be attempting to access Richard's accounts fraudulently. Jessica's investigation expanded to include Richard's longtime business partner, Thomas Blake, who had been handling the landscape architecture firm during Richard's illness. Thomas had similar concerns about discrepancies between what Helena had told him about Richard's final wishes and what Richard had actually communicated during their last business meeting. According to Thomas, Richard had been very clear that Jessica should inherit his share of the business, but Helena had contacted him, claiming that Richard had changed his mind and wanted to sell the business immediately, with proceeds going to Helena. The picture that emerged from these conversations was deeply troubling. It appeared that Helena had been telling different stories to different people about Richard's intentions, always positioning herself as the primary beneficiary while providing explanations that seemed designed to discourage further questions. Jessica realized that she needed to examine the original estate planning documents Richard had prepared before his marriage to Helena.
Patricia revealed that she had been trying to contact Richard during his final weeks to finalize some minor details in the estate planning documents, but Helena had repeatedly told her that Richard was too ill to meet and would contact her when he was feeling better. Patricia had assumed that Richard's condition had deteriorated more rapidly than expected, but now she suspected that Helena had been preventing communication deliberately. The most shocking revelation came when Patricia showed Jessica the actual will Richard had signed during their final meeting. The document bore no resemblance to what Helena had described. Jessica was named as the primary beneficiary of Richard's business, real estate, and investment accounts, while Helena was provided with a generous but limited inheritance designed to ensure her security without giving her control over the family assets. The will also contains specific provisions preventing Helena from making claims against the estate beyond what was explicitly provided. Jessica realized that Helena had been presenting forged documents and false information about Richard's intentions, but the scope of the deception was still unclear. Patricia suggested they examine Richard's financial records more thoroughly before the scheduled will reading, which Patricia confirmed she would be conducting based on the authentic documents in her possession. This revelation meant that Helena was expecting a will reading that would give her control over Richard's entire estate, while the actual will would provide her with a much smaller inheritance. The investigation took on greater urgency when Jessica discovered that Helena had been actively attempting to access Richard's accounts using forged documentation. Margaret Chen revealed that Helena had presented what appeared to be power of attorney documents attempting to gain control over Richard's investment accounts, claiming she needed access to pay estate expenses.
Only Margaret's insistence on additional verification had prevented Helena from successfully draining the accounts. Jessica also learned that Helena had been contacting Richard's insurance companies, attempting to claim benefits on policies where she was not the primary beneficiary. She had presented documentation claiming that Richard had changed his beneficiaries during his final illness, but the insurance companies had required additional verification that Helena had been unable to provide. These attempts suggested that Helena's fraud was far more extensive and systematic than Jessica had initially realized. The pattern of deception extended beyond financial matters. Jessica discovered that Helena had been lying to medical professionals about Richard's condition and treatment preferences during his final weeks. Dr. Amanda Foster, Richard's oncologist, revealed that Helena had been insisting on aggressive treatments that Richard had previously rejected, claiming he had changed his mind about his end-of-life care preferences. Dr. Foster had been concerned about the discrepancy, but had deferred to Helena's wishes as Richard's legal spouse and designated healthcare proxy. These medical revelations were particularly disturbing because they suggested that Helena had been willing to subject Richard to unnecessary suffering in order to maintain her position as his caregiver and decision-maker. Jessica began to question whether Richard's final weeks had been as peaceful as Helena had claimed and whether her father had been aware of Helena's deception during his final days. Jessica's investigation also uncovered evidence that Helena had been researching Richard's financial situation and family relationships long before their marriage. A conversation with Richard's neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, revealed that Helena had been asking detailed questions about Richard's assets and his relationship with Jessica from the very beginning of their courtship. Mrs. Walsh had thought Helena was simply trying to understand the family dynamics, but now the questions seemed calculated and invasive. More disturbing was Mrs. Walsh's revelation that she had overheard Helena making phone calls during Richard's final months, discussing strategies for claiming Richard's assets and dealing with potential challenges from Jessica. Mrs. Walsh had assumed Helena was simply being practical about estate planning, but the conversations had included details about forging documents and manipulating financial records that were clearly criminal in nature. The scope of Helena's deception became even clearer when Jessica examined Helena's background more thoroughly. The woman who had presented herself as an experienced hospice caregiver from Florida turned out to have no legitimate healthcare experience. Jessica's inquiries with Florida hospice organizations revealed no record of Helena Crawford working in the field, and her supposed references either did not exist or had no memory of employing her. Jessica also discovered that Helena had been using multiple identities in different states, always targeting vulnerable individuals facing serious illnesses or family crises. Her pattern was consistent. She would research vulnerable targets, create a background that would appeal to their specific needs, and gradually gain access to their finances while appearing to provide genuine care and support. Richard had not been her first victim, but he appeared to have been her most ambitious target. The revelation that Helena was a professional con artist rather than simply a greedy stepmother changed the entire situation. Jessica realized that her father had been the victim of a sophisticated criminal operation and that Helena's behavior during their marriage had been entirely calculated. Every kind gesture, every moment of apparent devotion, every expression of concern for Jessica's well-being had been part of an elaborate performance designed to facilitate theft. Jessica also learned that Helena had been preparing for Richard's death long before his condition became terminal. Evidence suggested that Helena had been forging documents and establishing fraudulent financial accounts during the early stages of Richard's treatment, when he was still relatively healthy and alert. This timeline indicated that Helena had never intended to be a genuine wife or caregiver, but had been planning to defraud Richard from the moment she entered his life. The emotional impact of these discoveries was devastating for Jessica. She had not only lost her father, but she had to confront the fact that his final years had been spent with someone who was systematically exploiting his trust and vulnerability. The woman Jessica had considered a blessing during her father's illness had actually been torturing him through manipulation and deception while preparing to steal everything he had worked to build for his daughter's future. Jessica's investigation revealed that Helena had been particularly cruel in her manipulation of Richard's relationship with his brother Marcus. Rather than genuinely encouraging family reconciliation, Helena had been using Marcus to gather information about Richard's assets and potential legal challenges to the estate.
She had been recording their conversations and using the information to refine her forgery efforts and anticipate obstacles to her plans. The discovery that Helena had been manipulating Richard's medication schedule was perhaps the most disturbing revelation. Jessica found evidence that Helena had been administering sedatives to Richard during periods when he might have been alert enough to understand financial documents or communicate with his attorney. This medication manipulation explained why Richard had seemed increasingly confused during his final months and why he had been unable to finalize his estate planning with Patricia Valdez. As Jessica compiled evidence of Helena's extensive fraud, she realized that the upcoming will reading would be more than just a legal formality. It would be a confrontation where Helena's entire deception would be exposed in front of witnesses, and where Jessica would finally be able to seek justice for her father's exploitation. Helena was expecting to claim victory over Richard's estate, but instead she would face criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The most painful aspect of Jessica's investigation was recognizing how completely Helena had deceived her. Jessica had prided herself on being a good judge of character, especially given her experience working with families in crisis situations. Helena had not only fooled Jessica about her genuine concern for Richard, but had actually used Jessica's trust to facilitate her access to Richard and his assets. Every conversation they had shared about Richard's care had been an opportunity for Helena to gather information and refine her deception. Jessica realized that Helena had been studying her reactions and responses throughout Richard's illness, learning how to manipulate her emotions and concerns to maintain her cooperation. Helena's apparent respect for Jessica's mother's memory and her encouragement of bonding activities between Jessica and Richard had been calculated moves designed to strengthen Jessica's trust and reduce any suspicions about Helena's motives. The investigation also revealed that Helena had been prepared for the possibility that her fraud might be discovered. She had established false identities and financial accounts in other states, suggesting that she had planned to disappear if her deception was exposed. This preparation indicated that Helena was an experienced criminal who had successfully defrauded other families and was confident in her ability to avoid consequences for her actions. As the will reading approached, Jessica prepared herself for a confrontation that would expose Helena's crimes and begin the process of seeking justice for her father's exploitation. She had compiled extensive evidence of the fraud, contacted law enforcement about the criminal aspects of Helena's behavior, and prepared herself emotionally for the moment when Helena would realize that her carefully constructed deception had been completely unraveled. The woman who had appeared to be the perfect stepmother was about to be revealed as a calculating criminal who had stolen not just money, but Richard's final months of peace and Jessica's trust in human decency. The will reading that Helena anticipated would confirm her victory would instead mark the beginning of her downfall and Jessica's quest for justice. The morning of the will reading arrived with an unusual tension that seemed to permeate the air in Patricia Valdez's law office. Jessica arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase filled with evidence she had compiled over the past week. She chose a seat facing the door, wanting to observe Helena's demeanor when she walked in. Jessica had called Patricia the night before to coordinate their strategy, ensuring that Helena's fraudulent activities would be exposed methodically and completely in front of witnesses. Helena entered the conference room precisely on time, dressed in a conservative black dress that projected appropriate grief while maintaining an air of quiet dignity. She carried herself with the same composed confidence Jessica had observed throughout Richard's illness, greeting Patricia warmly and expressing appreciation for handling Richard's affairs during such a difficult time. Helena took a seat across from Jessica, offering a sympathetic smile and commenting on how difficult these formal proceedings must be for both of them. Also present were Thomas Blake, Richard's business partner, Margaret Chen, his financial advisor, and Detective Ray Morrison from the Asheville Police Department, whom Jessica had contacted about Helena's fraudulent activities.
Helena seems slightly surprised by the presence of additional people beyond the immediate family, but Patricia explained that estate readings often included business associates and financial advisors when significant assets were involved. Patricia began the proceedings by explaining the legal formalities of probate and outlining the structure of Richard's estate. She described his assets methodically, including the landscape architecture business, the family home, investment accounts, and life insurance policies. Helena listened attentively, occasionally nodding as if confirming her understanding of assets she expected to inherit. Her demeanor remained calm and appropriately solemn throughout Patricia's initial presentation. The first indication that something was amiss came when Patricia mentioned that she had been Richard's attorney for over 20 years and had prepared his final will 6 months before his death. Helena's confident expression flickered slightly, but she quickly recovered, perhaps assuming that Richard had made additional modifications through the attorney she claimed he had consulted. Helena even commented that Richard had mentioned speaking with Patricia during his illness, maintaining her facade of being fully informed about his legal affairs. Patricia then began reading the actual will, starting with standard legal language before moving to the specific bequests. Helena's composure began to crack as Patricia detailed Richard's intentions, which bore no resemblance to the documents Helena had presented to Jessica. According to Richard's legitimate will, Jessica inherited the family business, the house, and the majority of his financial assets, where Helena received a modest inheritance designed to ensure her comfort but not wealth. Helena's reaction was immediate and revealing. Instead of expressing surprise or confusion about the discrepancy between what she had expected and what Patricia was reading, Helena became defensive and angry. She interrupted Patricia to claim that Richard had changed his mind during his final weeks and prepared new documents with a different attorney. Her response demonstrated knowledge of the will's contents that she couldn't have possessed if she had been genuinely surprised by the reading. When Patricia asked Helena to provide documentation of these supposed changes, Helena produced the forged documents she had shown Jessica earlier. Patricia examined them carefully, noting several inconsistencies that immediately identified them as fraudulent. The signatures were close approximations of Richard's handwriting, but lacked the subtle characteristics that Patricia recognized from decades of working with him. The legal language was also inconsistent with Richard's usual preferences and contained errors that his legitimate attorney would never have made. Margaret Chen confirmed that the financial changes described in Helena's documents had never been properly executed through legitimate banking channels. The account modifications Helena claimed Richard had made would have required verification procedures that had never been completed.
Margaret also revealed that Helena had been attempting to access Richard's accounts using forged power of attorney documents, attempts that had been blocked when the bank's fraud prevention measures identified inconsistencies in the documentation. Thomas Blake provided additional evidence that Helena had been misrepresenting Richard's wishes regarding the business. He testified that Richard had been very clear about wanting Jessica to inherit his share of the company, and that Helena's claims about Richard wanting to sell the business immediately were completely inconsistent with conversations Thomas had had with Richard just weeks before his death. Thomas also revealed that Helena had been pressuring him to provide financial information about the business that would have helped her determine its value for fraudulent purposes. Detective Morrison then presented evidence of Helena's criminal background, revealing that she had been operating under false identities and had targeted other wealthy individuals in similar circumstances. Her supposed experience as a hospice caregiver was entirely fabricated, and her references from previous employers were fictitious. The detective had traced Helena's activities across multiple states, uncovering a pattern of elder abuse and financial fraud that had been occurring for over a decade. The revelation of Helena's criminal history was devastating to any remaining credibility she might have claimed. Detective Morrison detailed how Helena would research potential targets through public records, obituaries, and medical facilities, identifying wealthy individuals facing serious illnesses who might be vulnerable to manipulation. She would then create false identities and backgrounds designed to appeal to their specific circumstances and needs. Helena's response to these revelations demonstrated the calculating nature of her personality. Rather than maintaining her innocent facade or expressing genuine surprise, she became increasingly aggressive and defensive.
She accused Jessica of fabricating evidence out of greed and jealousy, claiming that Richard had loved her more than his own daughter and had wanted to ensure her security. These accusations revealed the manipulative tactics Helena had likely used throughout her relationship with Richard. Patricia presented additional evidence that Helena had been forging Richard's signature on various documents during his final months. Handwriting analysis had revealed that while the signatures were skilled forgeries, they lacked the natural variation and pressure patterns of Richard's authentic writing. The analysis also showed that some documents had been signed with pens containing ink that wasn't available until after Richard's death, proving that Helena had been creating fraudulent documents even after his funeral. The medical evidence of Helena's abuse was particularly disturbing. Dr. Foster, Richard's oncologist, provided testimony about Helena's manipulation of Richard's treatment decisions and medication schedule. Helena had been administering unauthorized sedatives that kept Richard confused and compliant during periods when he should have been alert enough to understand legal documents. This medication abuse explained why Richard had seemed increasingly disoriented during his final weeks and why he had been unable to complete his estate planning with Patricia. Mrs. Walsh, Richard's neighbor, provided testimony overhearing Helena's phone conversations regarding strategies for claiming Richard's assets and dealing with potential legal challenges. These conversations had included detailed discussions about forging documents and manipulating financial records, proving that Helena's fraud had been premeditated and systematic rather than opportunistic. The evidence also revealed that Helena had been recording private conversations between Richard and his family members, using the information to refine her manipulation tactics and anticipate potential obstacles to her fraud. She had been particularly interested in Richard's relationship with Jessica, studying their interactions to understand how to maintain Jessica's trust while systematically deceiving her about Richard's condition and intentions. Helena's attempts to defend herself became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against her. She claimed that Richard had been mentally incompetent during his final months and that she had been acting in his best interests by managing his affairs. However, medical records showed that Richard had experienced periods of clarity throughout his illness and that Helena had been preventing him from communicating with his attorney and financial advisors during these lucid moments. The revelation that Helena had been manipulating Richard's communication with the outside world was particularly damning. She had been screening his phone calls, intercepting mail, and preventing visits from people who might have recognized signs of her abuse. This isolation had allowed Helena to maintain complete control over Richard's environment and prevent anyone from discovering her fraudulent activities until after his death. Detective Morrison then arrested Helena on charges of elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. As she was being handcuffed, Helena's composed facade finally cracked completely. She screamed accusations at Jessica, claiming that Richard had never loved her and that she deserved his money more than his ungrateful daughter. These outbursts revealed the depth of Helena's narcissism and her complete lack of genuine affection for Richard or remorse for her crimes. The aftermath of Helena's arrest involved extensive investigation into the full scope of her criminal activities. Law enforcement discovered that she had been operating similar fraud schemes in multiple states, targeting vulnerable elderly individuals and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars over more than a decade. Her arrest led to the reopening of several suspicious deaths that had occurred among her previous victims, suggesting that her crimes might have been even more serious than initially apparent. Jessica worked with authorities to recover assets that Helena had attempted to steal from Richard's estate. The investigation revealed hidden accounts where Helena had been transferring money during Richard's final months, as well as property purchases she had made using forged documents. While some of the stolen assets were recovered, the emotional damage of Helena's betrayal was irreparable. The legal proceedings that followed Helena's arrest provided additional insight into the sophistication of her criminal operation. She had been working with accomplices in other states who helped her establish false identities and create fraudulent documentation. The network had been operating for years, successfully targeting dozens of victims before Helena's greed and overconfidence led to her exposure in Richard's case. During the trial, Helena's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a woman who had genuinely cared for Richard, but had made poor decisions under emotional stress. However, the overwhelming evidence of premedication and systematic fraud made this defense impossible to maintain. Testimony from her previous victims revealed a pattern of calculated abuse that demonstrated Helena's complete lack of genuine emotion or empathy.
Jessica testifies about the emotional impact of discovering that her father's final years had been spent with someone who was systematically exploiting his trust and vulnerability. She described the devastating realization that every moment of apparent care and devotion had been part of an elaborate performance designed to facilitate theft. The testimony was particularly powerful because it demonstrated how Helena's crimes extended beyond financial fraud to include emotional abuse and manipulation. The prosecution presented evidence that Helena had been researching methods for hastening Richard's death, suggesting that her crimes might have extended to attempted murder. While this charge was difficult to prove definitively, the evidence indicated that Helena had been impatient with the natural progression of Richard's illness and had been exploring ways to accelerate her access to his assets. Helena's conviction on multiple felony charges resulted in a substantial prison sentence that reflected both the severity of her crimes and her status as a repeat offender. The judge noted that Helena's systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly individuals represented a particularly heinous form of abuse that deserved the maximum possible punishment. Her conviction also led to restitution orders that required her to repay stolen funds to her various victims. The investigation into Helena's crimes revealed that she had been planning to disappear after successfully defrauding Richard's estate. She had established new identities and financial accounts in other countries, suggesting that she had been preparing for the possibility that her fraud might be discovered. This preparation demonstrated the calculated nature of her crimes and her complete lack of intention to honor any genuine commitment to Richard or his family. Jessica's experience with Helena's betrayal led her to become an advocate for elder abuse prevention and education. She began speaking at conferences and training sessions for healthcare professionals, sharing her story to help others recognize the warning signs of systematic exploitation. Her advocacy work helped raise awareness about the sophisticated tactics used by professional con artists who target vulnerable elderly individuals. The recovery process for Jessica involved not only reclaiming her father's stolen assets, but also processing the emotional trauma of discovering that someone she had trusted had been systematically abusing her father. She sought counseling to deal with the guilt she felt about not recognizing Helena's deception sooner, and to process the anger she felt about her father's exploitation during his most vulnerable period. Jessica also worked to honor her father's memory by using his assets in ways that would have made him proud. She expanded the landscape architecture business and established a foundation that provided scholarships for students pursuing careers in environmental design. These activities helped her find positive meaning in the aftermath of Helena's betrayal and ensured that Richard's legacy would extend beyond the trauma of his final years. The case attracted significant media attention due to the sophistication of Helena's fraud and the systematic nature of her crimes against elderly victims. The coverage helped raise public awareness about the tactics used by con artists who target vulnerable individuals and led to improved protections for elderly people facing serious illnesses. Helena's conviction became a precedent for prosecuting similar cases of systematic elder abuse. Years later, Jessica reflected on the experience as a painful but ultimately transformative period in her life. While she would never fully recover from the knowledge that her father's final years had been tainted by Helena's deception, she found comfort in knowing that justice had been served and that her advocacy work was helping protect other families from similar exploitation. The experience had taught her that evil could present itself in the most convincing disguises, but that truth and persistence could ultimately prevail over even the most sophisticated deception. Helena's downfall served as a reminder that criminals who prey on vulnerable individuals often succeed through patience and careful manipulation, but that their greed and overconfidence eventually create opportunities for justice. Jessica's determination to investigate discrepancies in Helena's story, combined with the diligent work of law enforcement and legal professionals, had exposed a criminal operation that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The story of Helena's betrayal became a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining vigilance, even when dealing with people who appear to be providing genuine care and support. Jessica's experience demonstrated that family members should trust their instincts when something seems inconsistent, and that professional criminals often succeed by exploiting the natural human tendency to trust people who appear to be helpful during times of crisis. The impact of Helena's arrest reverberated through the entire Asheville community, where Richard had been a respected businessman and Helena had cultivated the image of a devoted caregiver. News of her criminal activities shocked neighbors, medical professionals, and business associates who had witnessed what they believed was genuine love and dedication. The revelation that Helena's entire persona had been fabricated forced everyone to question their ability to recognize deception, even when it was occurring directly in front of them. Jessica found herself fielding countless phone calls from people who had interacted with Helena during Richard's illness. Dr. Foster expressed deep regret about deferring to Helena's wishes regarding Richard's treatment, realizing that her professional instincts had been correct when she sensed something was wrong with Helena's insistence on aggressive interventions. The oncologist began implementing new protocols in her practice to better protect vulnerable patients from potential exploitation by family members or caregivers. The nursing staff at the hospital where Richard had received treatment were particularly disturbed by the revelations about Helena's true nature. They had admired what they perceived as her dedication and expertise, often using her as an example of exceptional family caregiving when training new staff members. The discovery that Helena had been systematically abusing Richard while appearing to provide exemplary care forced the hospital to reevaluate their procedures for recognizing signs of elder abuse in seemingly ideal caregiving situations. Margaret Chen, Richard's financial advisor, implemented new verification procedures for her practice after realizing how close Helena had come to successfully accessing her clients' accounts. She began requiring multiple forms of authentication for any requests involving elderly clients, regardless of how legitimate the requests appeared on the surface. Margaret also started conducting regular check-ins with family members of vulnerable clients to ensure that financial decisions were being made with full knowledge and consent. Thomas Blake struggled with guilt about not recognizing Helena's deception sooner, particularly regarding her attempts to manipulate the business sale. He had sensed that something was wrong with Helena's claims about Richard's wishes, but had hesitated to challenge her directly out of respect for what he believed was genuine grief. The experience taught him to trust his professional instincts more completely, even when doing so might seem insensitive to grieving family members. The investigation into Helena's background revealed a criminal history that was far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. Detective Morrison discovered that she had been operating under at least 6 different identities over the past 15 years, targeting wealthy individuals across multiple states. Her victims included a retired judge in South Carolina, a wealthy widow in Georgia, and several elderly business owners in Tennessee and Virginia. The scope of her criminal enterprise suggested that she had stolen millions of dollars from vulnerable individuals over the course of her career.
Helena's method of operation was remarkably consistent across all her crimes. She would identify potential targets through obituaries, medical facility contacts, or social media posts indicating family health crises. She would then research the individual's financial situation, family relationships, and personal interests to create a false identity that would appeal to their specific circumstances. Her approach was so sophisticated that she had successfully avoided detection for over a decade before her greed and overconfidence in Richard's case led to her exposure. The revelation of Helena's criminal network led to additional arrests of accomplices who had helped her create false identities and forged documents. These individuals included a document forger in Miami, a private investigator who had helped her research potential targets, and several associates who had posed as references for her fabricated employment history. The dismantling of this criminal organization prevented further victimization of elderly individuals and provided law enforcement with valuable intelligence about how such schemes operate. Jessica's testimony during Helena's trial was emotionally devastating, but ultimately cathartic. She described in detail how Helena had manipulated her trust and exploited her desire to support her father during his illness. Jessica explained how Helena had used her medical knowledge and professional instincts against her, making her feel guilty for questioning someone who appeared to be providing exceptional care. The testimony helped the jury understand how sophisticated criminals can exploit even trained professionals who should be capable of recognizing deception. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Helena's previous victims, many of whom had been too traumatized or embarrassed to report their experiences initially. These witnesses described similar patterns of manipulation and exploitation, demonstrating that Helena's abuse of Richard was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic criminal enterprise. Their courage in coming forward helped ensure that Helena received the maximum possible sentence for her crimes. Helena's defense strategy involved attempting to portray her as a woman who had genuinely fallen in love with Richard, but had made poor decisions under emotional stress. Her attorney argued that she had been overwhelmed by grief and financial pressure, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to secure her future after Richard's death. However, the extensive evidence of premeditation and systematic fraud made this defense completely unconvincing to the jury. The trial also revealed disturbing evidence that Helena had been researching methods for accelerating Richard's death, including information about medication interactions and palliative care procedures that could be misused. While prosecutors could not prove attempted murder beyond a reasonable doubt, the evidence suggested that Helena had been impatient with the natural progression of Richard's illness and had been exploring ways to hasten her access to his assets. Helena's conviction on multiple felony charges resulted in a 25-year prison sentence, reflecting both the severity of her crimes and her status as a repeat offender. The judge noted that Helena's systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly individuals represented a particularly heinous form of abuse that warranted the maximum possible punishment. Her conviction also established important legal precedents for prosecuting similar cases of systematic elder abuse and financial exploitation. The restitution orders associated with Helena's conviction required her to repay millions of dollars to her various victims, though much of the stolen money had been spent or hidden in offshore accounts that remained difficult to trace. Jessica was able to recover most of her father's assets, but the emotional damage caused by Helena's betrayal could never be fully compensated through financial means. Jessica's experience with Helena's betrayal fundamentally changed her perspective on trust and vulnerability. As a healthcare professional, she had always prided herself on her ability to assess people's character and motivations accurately. Helena's successful deception forced Jessica to recognize that even trained professionals could be manipulated by sufficiently skilled criminals, and that appearances could be completely divorced from reality. The recovery process for Jessica involved extensive counseling to address the complex emotions surrounding her father's exploitation. She struggled with guilt about not recognizing Helena's deception sooner, anger about her father's suffering during his final months, and grief over the loss of trust in human relationships that Helena's betrayal had caused. The counseling helped Jessica understand that her desire to trust Helena was natural and appropriate given the circumstances, and that sophisticated criminals succeed precisely by exploiting normal human emotions and responses. Jessica also had to process the devastating realization that her father's final years had been tainted by systematic abuse and manipulation. She wondered whether Richard had suspected Helena's true nature, but had been too sick or isolated to seek help. The possibility that her father had suffered in silence while appearing to be well cared for was almost unbearable for Jessica to contemplate. The investigation revealed that Helena had been recording private conversations between Richard and his family members, using the information to refine her manipulation tactics and anticipate potential obstacles to her fraud. These recordings provided disturbing insight into how Helena had systematically isolated Richard from people who might have recognized signs of abuse or questioned her motives. Helena had been particularly interested in Richard's relationship with Jessica, studying their interactions to understand how to maintain Jessica's trust while deceiving her about Richard's condition and intentions. The recordings revealed that Helena had been coaching Richard on what to say during phone conversations with Jessica, ensuring that he didn't inadvertently reveal information that might expose her deception. The discovery of these recordings was particularly traumatic for Jessica because it revealed that even her most private moments with her father had been violated by Helena's criminal activities. The knowledge that Helena had been analyzing their conversations for criminal purposes added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation.
These relationships helped Jessica understand that her experience, while uniquely painful, was part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior that required systematic responses rather than individual solutions. The media attention surrounding Helena's case helped raise public awareness about the sophisticated tactics used by criminals who prey on vulnerable elderly individuals. Jessica's willingness to share her story publicly, despite the personal pain involved, helped educate families about the importance of maintaining vigilance even when dealing with apparently dedicated caregivers.
Her interviews and public appearances provided valuable information about warning signs that might indicate systematic exploitation. The case also highlighted the need for better coordination between different professional communities that interact with elderly individuals. Healthcare providers, financial institutions, legal professionals, and law enforcement agencies often operate independently, making it easier for criminals like Helena to exploit gaps in communication and oversight. Jessica's advocacy work helped promote better information sharing and collaboration between these different sectors. Years after Helena's conviction, Jessica continued to receive contacts from law enforcement agencies investigating similar cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Her expertise and experience made her a valuable resource for understanding the psychological and practical aspects of systematic elder abuse. She frequently served as a consultant on complex cases involving sophisticated criminal operations targeting vulnerable individuals. The emotional healing process for Jessica was long and complicated, involving not only grief over her father's death, but also trauma from discovering the extent of his exploitation. She found that traditional grief counseling was insufficient for addressing the complex emotions involved in learning that someone she had trusted had been systematically abusing her father. Specialized therapy for victims of elder abuse helped her develop strategies for processing the betrayal and rebuilding her capacity for trust. Jessica's relationships with other family members were also affected by Helena's crimes. Her uncle Marcus, who had reconciled with Richard during his final year, struggled with guilt about not recognizing signs of Helena's manipulation. The family had to work together to process their shared trauma and develop new patterns of communication that would help them support each other while remaining vigilant about potential exploitation. The experience also changed Jessica's approach to her professional responsibilities as a healthcare provider. She became much more attuned to signs of potential abuse or exploitation in the families of her pediatric patients, recognizing that criminal behavior could occur in seemingly ideal family situations. Her enhanced awareness helped her identify and report several cases of suspected abuse that might otherwise have gone undetected. Jessica's story became a case study used in medical schools and nursing programs to teach students about the complexity of family dynamics and the importance of maintaining professional skepticism even when dealing with apparently caring family members. Her experience demonstrated that healthcare providers must be prepared to recognize and respond to sophisticated forms of abuse that might not fit traditional patterns of family violence. The legal precedents established by Helena's conviction helped prosecutors in other jurisdictions pursue similar cases more effectively. The systematic documentation of Helena's criminal methods and the successful prosecution of her accomplices provided a template for investigating and prosecuting complex elder abuse cases. These precedents were particularly important because sophisticated financial crimes against elderly victims had historically been difficult to prosecute successfully. Helena's case also contributed to improvements in banking and financial industry practices designed to protect elderly customers from exploitation. Financial institutions began implementing more sophisticated monitoring systems to detect unusual account activity and requiring additional verification for large transactions involving elderly account holders. These changes helped prevent future victimization while balancing the need to protect vulnerable individuals with their right to financial independence. The investigation into Helena's crimes revealed that she had been planning to establish a new identity and disappear after successfully defrauding Richard's estate. She had been making preparations to move to another country where she could continue her criminal activities without fear of detection by American law enforcement. The discovery of these plans demonstrated the international scope of elder abuse crimes and the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies across different jurisdictions. Jessica's transformation from victim to advocate represented a powerful example of how individuals can find meaning and purpose in the aftermath of devastating personal trauma. Her decision to channel her pain into efforts to protect other families from similar exploitation demonstrated remarkable resilience and provided hope for other survivors of elder abuse. Her work showed that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into forces for positive change and social justice. The ongoing impact of Jessica's advocacy work extended far beyond her immediate community, influencing national conversations about elder abuse prevention and inspiring similar efforts in other regions. Her story became a powerful tool for educating the public about the reality of sophisticated criminal operations targeting vulnerable elderly individuals, helping to dispel misconceptions about who commits these crimes and how they operate. Jessica's experience with Helena's betrayal ultimately taught her that while trust remained important in human relationships, it must be balanced with appropriate vigilance and professional skepticism. Her ability to rebuild her capacity for meaningful relationships while maintaining awareness of potential exploitation represented a successful adaptation to the trauma she had experienced. Her continued work in elder abuse prevention ensured that her father's suffering would contribute to protecting other families from similar devastating betrayals. The psychological profile that emerged during Helena's evaluation for sentencing revealed a complex criminal mind that had been perfecting her methods for decades. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to assess Helena, discovered that her subject displayed classic characteristics of antisocial personality disorder combined with an unusually high level of intelligence and emotional manipulation skills. Helena's ability to maintain her deceptive persona for years without showing cracks in her facade indicated a level of psychological control that was both impressive and terrifying. During her interviews with Helena, Dr. Chen found that the convicted criminal showed no genuine remorse for her actions and continued to view her victims as willing participants in transactions that benefited both parties. Helena insisted that she had provided valuable caregiving services to Richard and that her compensation through inheritance fraud was justified by the work she had performed. This complete absence of empathy or understanding of the harm she had caused was consistent with her diagnosis and helped explain how she had been able to continue her criminal activities for so many years without being deterred by guilt or conscience. Helena's prison interviews also revealed the meticulous planning that had gone into each of her criminal schemes. She had maintained detailed records of potential targets, including financial assessments, family relationship analyses, and vulnerability evaluations that read like business plans for exploitation. Her organizational skills were remarkable, with color-coded files containing information about dozens of elderly individuals she had researched as potential victims over the years.
The depth of Helena's research into her victims was particularly disturbing. She had compiled psychological profiles of her targets that included their emotional needs, their relationships with family members, their fears about aging and death, and their financial concerns about end-of-life care. This information allowed her to tailor her approach to each individual's specific vulnerabilities, making her deception far more effective than random criminal opportunism. Helena's case files revealed that she had actually rejected many potential targets because they didn't meet her criteria for successful exploitation. She preferred victims who were wealthy but not extremely sophisticated about financial matters, who had some family connections but weren't surrounded by large protective networks, and who were facing serious illnesses that would make them grateful for apparent caregiving expertise. Richard had been an ideal target because he met all of these criteria while also being recently widowed and therefore emotionally vulnerable to romantic manipulation. The investigation into Helena's methods revealed that she had been studying her victims for months, or even years, before making contact. She would attend medical facilities, support groups, and community events where she could observe potential targets and gather information about their circumstances. Her patient approach allowed her to identify the most vulnerable individuals and develop detailed strategies for approaching them at moments when they would be most receptive to her apparent offers of help and companionship. Helena's criminal network included accomplices who specialized in different aspects of elder abuse fraud. She worked with document forgers who could create convincing medical records, financial statements, and legal documents. She had contacts in the healthcare industry who provided information about wealthy patients facing serious illnesses. She even had relationships with funeral directors who would alert her to recently deceased spouses of potentially wealthy individuals, allowing her to target newly widowed victims during their most vulnerable period. The sophistication of Helena's operation extended to her use of technology for research and communication. She maintained multiple smartphones and internet accounts under different identities,
allowing her to conduct surveillance and research without leaving trails that could be traced back to her real identity. She used social media monitoring tools to track potential victims and their family members, gathering information that helped her understand family dynamics and identify opportunities for manipulation. Helena's financial crimes were equally sophisticated, involving complex schemes to move stolen money through multiple accounts and jurisdictions. She had established offshore accounts in countries with strict banking privacy laws, making it difficult for law enforcement to trace and recover stolen funds. Her money laundering operations included real estate purchases, investment schemes, and business partnerships that provided apparent legitimacy for her illegal income. The scope of Helena's crimes extended beyond financial fraud to include identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges related to her criminal network. Federal prosecutors were able to demonstrate that her activities crossed state lines and involved the use of electronic communications, bringing her crimes under federal jurisdiction and allowing for more severe penalties than would have been possible under state law alone. Jessica's role as a witness in the federal investigation required her to testify not only about Helena's specific crimes against Richard, but also about the patterns of behavior that connected Helena's case to other victims across multiple states. This testimony was emotionally difficult for Jessica because it required her to relive her father's exploitation repeatedly, while also learning about the suffering of other families who had experienced similar betrayals. The federal investigation revealed that Helena's crimes had affected over 30 families across 7 states, with total losses exceeding $4 million. The victims ranged in age from 62 to 91 and included retired professionals, business owners, and widowed individuals who had been targeted during health crises or bereavement periods. The systematic nature of Helena's crimes and the vulnerability of her victims made her case a priority for federal prosecutors seeking to establish strong precedents for elder abuse prosecutions. The trial proceedings stretched over several months as prosecutors presented evidence of Helena's extensive criminal activities. Jessica attended most of the trial sessions, finding that witnessing the legal process helped her understand the full scope of Helena's crimes and provided a sense of closure about her father's exploitation. The experience also connected her with other victims' families, creating a support network that would prove valuable for her continued healing and advocacy work. Helena's sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from families across multiple states, providing the court with a comprehensive understanding of the devastation caused by her crimes. Jessica's statement was particularly powerful because she was able to articulate not only the financial losses, but also the emotional trauma of discovering that her father's final years had been tainted by systematic abuse and exploitation. The judge's sentencing decision reflected the severity of Helena's crimes and her lack of remorse. In addition to the 25-year prison sentence, Helena was ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims and was permanently banned from working in healthcare or caregiving roles. The sentence sent a strong message about the criminal justice system's commitment to protecting elderly individuals from sophisticated exploitation schemes. Helena's conviction and sentencing received extensive media coverage that helped raise public awareness about the reality of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Jessica participated in several television interviews and documentary projects that used Helena's case to educate families about warning signs and prevention strategies. These media appearances were emotionally challenging for Jessica, but served an important public education function that helped prevent future victimization. The documentary about Helena's crimes and their impact on victims' families became a powerful educational tool used by law enforcement agencies, healthcare organizations, and social service providers. Jessica's participation in the documentary helped humanize the statistics about elder abuse and demonstrated the long-term effects of financial exploitation on families and communities. Jessica's advocacy work expanded to include collaboration with researchers studying the psychological and social factors that make elderly individuals vulnerable to exploitation. Her insights as both a healthcare professional and a victim's family member provided valuable perspectives for developing more effective prevention strategies and intervention protocols. The research collaborations led to the development of new assessment tools for identifying elderly individuals at risk of financial exploitation. These tools incorporated lessons learned from Helena's case about the sophisticated methods used by professional criminals and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating caregiving relationships. Jessica's work with law enforcement agencies included training programs for detectives and prosecutors handling elder abuse cases. Her ability to explain the emotional dynamics of exploitation from a victim's family perspective helped law enforcement professionals understand the complexities of investigating crimes where victims may be unable or unwilling to report abuse. The training programs Jessica developed were adopted by police departments and prosecutors' offices across multiple states, extending the impact of her advocacy work far beyond her immediate community. Her materials became standard resources for law enforcement professionals learning to recognize and investigate sophisticated elder abuse schemes. Jessica's collaboration with financial institutions focused on developing better protocols for protecting elderly customers from exploitation while respecting their autonomy and privacy rights. Her insights helped banks and investment firms understand how criminals like Helena could manipulate financial transactions and what warning signs might indicate that an elderly customer was being exploited.
The financial industry protocols that emerged from these collaborations included enhanced monitoring systems for accounts belonging to elderly customers, improved training for bank employees about recognizing signs of exploitation, and better coordination between financial institutions and law enforcement agencies when suspicious activity was detected. Jessica's work with healthcare organizations addressed the need for medical professionals to be more aware of financial exploitation as a form of elder abuse. Her presentations helped doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers understand how sophisticated criminals could manipulate medical situations to gain access to vulnerable patients and their assets. The healthcare training programs Jessica developed emphasize the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and being alert to warning signs that might indicate a patient was being exploited by family members or caregivers. These programs helped medical professionals understand their role in protecting vulnerable patients without compromising the therapeutic relationship. Jessica's advocacy work also addressed the needs of family members who discover that their elderly relatives have been victims of financial exploitation. She developed support groups and counseling resources specifically designed for families dealing with the complex emotions and practical challenges that arise when elder abuse is discovered. The support groups Jessica established became models for similar programs in other communities, providing families with practical guidance about legal and financial recovery processes, while also addressing the emotional trauma associated with discovering that a loved one had been exploited. Jessica's continued involvement in elder abuse prevention led to her appointment to several state and national committees focused on protecting vulnerable adults. Her expertise as both a healthcare professional and a victim's family member made her a valuable contributor to policy discussions about strengthening legal protections and improving coordination between different agencies and organizations. The policy work Jessica engaged in resulted in legislative changes that enhanced penalties for elder abuse crimes, improved coordination between agencies investigating exploitation cases, and provided better resources for victims and their families. Her advocacy helped ensure that the lessons learned from Helena's case would have lasting impact on elder abuse prevention efforts. Jessica's personal healing journey continued for years after Helena's conviction, involving ongoing therapy and support group participation. She found that her advocacy work, while meaningful and important, also required her to continually revisit the trauma of her father's exploitation, making her own recovery process more complex and prolonged. The therapeutic process helped Jessica understand that her guilt about not recognizing Helena's deception sooner was both natural and unfounded. She learned that sophisticated criminals like Helena succeed precisely because they are skilled at exploiting normal human emotions and responses, and that even trained professionals can be deceived by sufficiently skilled manipulators. Jessica's relationship with her extended family required careful rebuilding after Helena's crimes were revealed. Family members struggled with their own guilt about not recognizing the exploitation and had to work together to develop new patterns of communication and support that would help them process their shared trauma. The family healing process involved professional counseling sessions that helped family members understand how Helena had manipulated their relationships and prevented them from communicating effectively with Richard during his final months. These sessions were crucial for helping the family move beyond blame and guilt toward mutual support and understanding.
Jessica's romantic relationships were also affected by her experience with Helena's betrayal, as she struggled to rebuild her capacity for trust after discovering how completely she had been deceived by someone she had considered family. Therapy helped her understand that her caution about trusting others was a natural response to trauma, but that it didn't have to prevent her from forming meaningful relationships. The process of rebuilding trust in relationships required Jessica to develop new skills for assessing people's character and motivations while maintaining openness to genuine connection. She learned to balance appropriate caution with the willingness to be vulnerable that healthy relationships require. Jessica's professional career as a pediatric nurse was enhanced by her increased awareness of family dynamics and potential exploitation situations. Her experience with Helena's crimes made her more attuned to signs that children might be in dangerous situations, even when their families appeared to be functioning normally on the surface. The professional development that resulted from Jessica's trauma experience made her a more effective healthcare provider and a valuable resource for colleagues dealing with complex family situations. Her ability to recognize sophisticated manipulation tactics helped her identify cases where children might be at risk despite appearances to the contrary. Jessica's story became a case study used in nursing schools and medical schools to teach students about the complexity of family relationships and the importance of maintaining appropriate professional skepticism. Her experience demonstrated that healthcare providers must be prepared to recognize and respond to sophisticated forms of abuse that might not fit traditional patterns. The educational materials developed from Jessica's case help prepare new healthcare professionals to recognize warning signs of exploitation and abuse while maintaining compassionate relationships with patients and families. These materials became standard components of curricula in healthcare education programs across the country. Jessica's ongoing work in elder abuse prevention continued to evolve as she gained experience and expertise in the field. She became a nationally recognized expert on financial exploitation of elderly individuals and a sought-after speaker at conferences and training events. The recognition Jessica received for her advocacy work, while gratifying, also served as a constant reminder of the trauma that had motivated her efforts. She learned to balance her public role as an advocate with her private need for healing and normal life experiences. Jessica's story inspired other victims' families to become advocates for elder abuse prevention, creating a growing network of individuals committed to protecting vulnerable elderly individuals from exploitation. This network became a powerful force for policy change and public education about elder abuse issues. The ripple effects of Jessica's advocacy work extended far beyond her individual efforts, inspiring systematic changes in how society approaches elder abuse prevention and response. Her willingness to share her painful experience publicly helped transform a personal tragedy into a force for positive social change that would protect countless other families from similar exploitation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.